You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Dan Kish, it's great to have you back on the program. Welcome.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thanks for having me.
And boy, we won't even get into the other topics like Syria, but which I'm sure you'd have some interesting things to say on. But Dan, I opened up my Wall Street Journal this morning, and right there, smack dab in the middle, is another story of the EPA curbing the new coal power plants, and of course, this whole idea that they have to install new equipment to capture greenhouse emissions. And I'm like, when are we going to stop this nonsense?
Yeah. You didn't even have to open it. It's on the front page.
That's why I folded it in half.
I got it. Mine comes like that, too. At any rate, you're absolutely right. It looks as though they're nearing their final plan for new coal plants. Under the previous rule they had put out there as a trial balloon, basically there would be no new coal plants built because the technology to do so does not exist. The law requires that it exists. They got a lot of pushback on that. It led to the war on coal allegations, and now they're coming out with something which looks a little bit different, but isn't much different. The technology still doesn't exist. They're basing it on a plant that is still being built that may or may not meet that and is particularly situated so that it can do so easily if they manage to pull it off. But it's a coal plant right next to an oil field, and there's a reason why that works and that sort of thing. But basically, this goes along. We all go back to 2008 when the president said, under his plan, you could build a coal plant, but it would bankrupt you. And in order to make his energy plan work, which is to push alternative sources of energy, the ones he likes and subsidizes heavily, into the mix, you basically have to make electricity prices skyrocket because otherwise those types of energy sources can't compete.
Now, right off the bat, my biggest problem is that I so strongly believe in free markets that I feel like the government, outside of just ensuring safety, should not be picking winners and losers. And clearly, they have just outright assaulted several states where coal's such a big factor. But they're waging war on the industry itself. And so several questions I'd have, Dan, are, one, there are alternatives to coal, but to me, some of those alternatives, like nuclear, when's the last time we've built a nuclear plant? We should be adding to refinery capacity. Are we doing that? Or are we approving anything? Or are we just hoping that we can live off of solar panels and windmills that aren't working either?
Yeah, well, here's the truth is we are doing some things, but not because of the government, despite it. And as a matter of fact, where the government has any say in it, for example, oil production is growing at a very rapid rate. Natural gas production, we're the number one producer of natural gas in the world, and prices have dropped significantly for people as a consequence. We still import don't get me wrong, we still import a sizable, very large portion of our oil, but a trend has been reversed because of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, the combination thereof, but mostly because of private lands and state lands. On the federal lands, the production is going down, and so you've got the greatest increases in history of oil production on lands that aren't where the government has no say, and significant declines on lands and waters where the government has a say, and that's pretty remarkable. On the thing is, you just got done talking about Syria and the Middle East and its relationship to oil and the other thing. Just a little factoid that may help put this in place. the United States has 27% of the world's proven coal reserves. Saudi Arabia has 16% of the world's proven oil reserves. If you can imagine the Saudis giving up oil as a part of their economy, and its impact on the world in terms of this, and it's so fundamentally strange that our government would take the resource, which we have the largest supplies of in the world by far, and say you can't use it. Basically, they're saying you can use it, but all you have to do is stand on your head, spit nickels made out of titanium, and do everything else that's impossible, and we'll let you make it. But basically, it's it's Joseph Heller catch-22 stuff. That's their plan. They're sticking to it.
And I can give you that answer because I correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that energy is 90%, or gas and oil is 90% of the Saudi Arabian economy.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So it would be absolutely devastating, which is your point.
Yeah. Well, and it also shows that it's also that the idea that if the Saudis found that they had a problem with oil production or oil consumption or something like that, they would I'm sure seek ways to do it in a way that was positive, not say that, well, unless you do something which is currently impossible, we are going to start saying you can drill no more wells. And that essentially is what our government's doing. At the same time, they continue to expose the American taxpayer to the sort of liabilities as a consequence of their tax policies, and I'm not talking about tax deductions. I'm talking about government handouts to wind and solar and all the rest that are going to come due in the same way that they've come due in Germany, where the electricity prices are three times what they are in the United States. And they use Germany as an example of what we ought to follow. So if you like your electric bill, triple it and see how you'd like it then.
So, Dan, I have a question for you. One of the things that I have read from multiple sources, and I'm not sure if this is slightly outside of your area of expertise, but please comment if it's not, is that part of the struggle going on in Syria behind the scenes right now is the fact that Syria sits in a strategic position between Saudi Arabia and Iraq and oil access, meaning pipeline oil access up through Turkey and or to the Mediterranean. And the fact that the Russians, by virtue of having a strategic hold over Syria, stand to gain. If they have control over that area and they prevent those pipelines, then that increases the likelihood of Russia continuing to have oil dominance or control over much of Europe and maintain a higher cost of distributing oil from the Middle East. Any awareness or commentary on that? And behind the scenes battle, I understand, is really the Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq versus the Russia's oil interest, and of course mineral rights in Russia are an enormous part of their economic prowess as well.
Absolutely, John, and I am not as up to speed on the issue over the pipelines as I would like to be, but I have read some of the same things I believe you probably have. But the one thing that I would say is, as I understand it, and there may be oil as well, but the principal issue there happens to be natural gas and gas pipelines. As you know, the Soviet Union, Russia, has set up a wide gas distribution system throughout Europe. Ronald Reagan warned against this. In fact, put a lot of pressure on the Western Europeans not to take then Soviet gas through a pipeline that they were proposing to build, because he rightly predicted that that would give them a lot of say over their economic performance. Long and short of it is they're vying,
which is absolutely nuts, right? I mean, that's the same logic like me saying, since some of my money is contributing to your health, I have a right to tell you what to eat.
Anyhow, there are competing pipelines, as I understand it, between that would like to pass through Syria, one with the backing of the Soviets and I keep coming back to the Soviets only because they're acting like it lately, the Russians and Iranians, and then there's the pipeline that Saudi Arabia and Qatar would like to be able to tie up with also, which would require Syrian transit. And there seems to be some argument in some quarters that there is a relationship and stranger things have happened. I know the Qatari government has given huge amounts of money to the Syrian rebels. Whether it's the good guys, the bad guys, if you can pick them apart, I'm not sure our own government can.
Well, at minimum, at minimum. Look, the one thing I will say is this entire game makes strange bedfellows. And when I use the term oil before, I'm really referring to both gas and oil because it's sort of an equal problem, slightly different commodity, but same issue. And you're right. It's one of the biggest strategic mistakes I think that Europe has made because it completely neuters their ability to use. It's like throwing away decades of hard-fought battles, mostly defensive, to win for the forces of liberty and then hand it over, much like we saw in the speech the other day, right? Handing over control of what strategic decisions will be made to somebody who has pretty much said he doesn't have our best interest in mind. I wanted to, along with that, though, I want to tie in another big issue here, which we've discussed to some extent in the past, but it seems to be rising its head more again, which is the fact that petrodollars, so global trade is currently tied to the U.S. dollar. And you actually have now in Russian press and elsewhere, you're starting to see public comments and articles, almost like they're testing the waters, to start complaining about the fact that they have to change this equation and stop having the dollar be the denomination that oil and energy is traded on the world stage. And I think, and I'd like you to speak to this, but I think that would have a devastating impact on what's left of our strategic prowess.
Being the reserve currency in the world is generally means that you are the strongest economy in the world, perceived without a doubt as the strongest economy in the world. Your weight goes further in terms of protecting your interests economically and the interests of your businesses, both at home and abroad. It's almost it's a right with which comes some responsibilities. Those responsibilities include making sure your currency is sound, that it's trustworthy, that your word is trustworthy in international matters, and I think on a number and in a whole other array of issues, and I think you might surmise that is going to be tested increasingly, especially in light of some of the things that we've seen in the past week, as well as some of the economic things that have been happening here at home and continue to happen. And John, we're watching the managed and some people would even argue deliberate decline of the United States on our watch. And it's happening in a way that I think a lot of people are surprised at the speed at which it's happening. And energy has everything to do with it. I mean, the reason I said I'm not surprised that matters like pipelines and petroleum and its products have a significant impact on foreign policies that they do, and yet while the rest of the world sweats bullets over these issues, our own government can't make a decision about a pipeline coming over the border from our neighbor and ally and largest trading partner, Canada, and seems destined not to, and takes our largest in the world coal supplies and puts them off limits from our own people, which is a built-in strength. So if you've got one hand that's better than the other, and you cut off your good hand, those people who would like to wrestle with you probably hasten the speed at which they want to wrestle with you.
Well, this is where these things tie together, Dan. Let's face it. One of the biggest strategic weaknesses it gives us, the potential loss of reserve currency being denominated in greenback, is things like applying sanctions. It's one of the big reasons people like Iran and Russia right now are gaining huge tactical advantage to some degree because they're outplaying us, to a large degree, as you pointed out, because our president is pretty much handing over the reins to the wagon, saying, I really have no idea how to be a cowboy. Somebody better ought to take the ship. But let's make no mistake, Dan. There are three things that people absolutely will not do about it. If you ever want to find your friend will eat you in the lifeboat if necessary to stay alive: food, water, and energy. People might be fine walking around naked with their buddy, but let's face it, at the end of the day, if your society needs food, water, or energy, you will turn on your friends, you will turn on your family, you will absolutely turn on your allies and your neighbors, and that is where we have a huge problem here. And, of course, we're talking about energy now, but we're also talking in areas where, we can't underplay some of the things that are also happening. I know it's certainly not your area of expertise, but certainly water and food are on equal par with this game of, let's call it, commodities domination.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Whether it's a family seeking to better its position, better the health of its own family members, better the health of its children and of all of its people, and or a nation, or all of these things. It isn't that complicated when you come right down to it. There are certain necessities of life, especially modern life, and for the last couple of hundred years, it's included energy. And the question is, do you play energy for keeps, or do you play it as though it's some sort of Washington parlor game, between the various interest groups and pick your winners and losers and that sort of thing? And how long can you continue to do that successfully without undermining the economic stability of your country and therefore everything else? Because as the economic prowess of the United States is directly attached to our ability to project our force economically as well as militarily. If you can't afford to do things militarily, then you have to step back, and that means someone else with more will or more dedication to that particular part of the world will take over. And this is the problem with the incredibly shrinking United States, the punctum, if you will, of the United States by its own government.
I have a final question for you, but I want to make a quick comment. There was another article completely unrelated to this that came out about in the education system about the Middle East Studies programs putting out maps where they show Palestine versus Israel, right? Maps of the Middle East, like this week in college campuses. And what I want to point out to our listeners here is you could play all the emotional games you want about abortion or gay rights or things like this, but our country is not going to live or die on these issues. When you talk about giving petrol dollars to the Middle East for people who are then taking those dollars, turning around, buying our weapons and buying our school systems, thus buying the minds of our kids, this is a nightmare. So anyway, here's a quick question for you. I read that, and this hasn't been seen much in the news, but I've read that this year the polar ice, the Arctic ice caps have grown exponentially, and everybody in the news seems to be avoiding this. Any idea what the reality is of that, and how we analyze this in a sense where it brings any real meaning?
Well, I've read the same thing. The polar ice caps have expanded enormously. Last year they had shrunk significantly. Now they've the Northwest Passage through which we were putting ships last year does not exist, and the coverage is much more than any of the climate models would have predicted, that sort of thing. All I can say is that the reason you're not reading about it is because the media doesn't like to print anything that doesn't confirm Al Gore's vision of the world and the Obama administration's view of why we ought to rearrange our economy to reflect that highest priority of his, which is stopping global warming, or at least us from doing things that might be in our own best interest. And all I can add about that is I just this afternoon watched Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, who is one of the most hysterical members in the Senate about climate change, can't stop talking about it, lecture people about the Keystone Pipeline and why we couldn't build it, because for the first time in millions of years, humans on Earth don't have a livable climate anymore. And I just happened to look up that 17,000 years ago, Rhode Island was covered with a sea of ice, and it extended all the way down to New Jersey. And I guess he considers that to be environmental optimism, but I don't know. I don't. Give me a beach any day.
That's a good point. Dan, if I can, I want to go back to the idea of who our friends are in the Middle East. And quite frankly, I feel as though after all these decades of watching the cycle of violence, of watching terrorism and just the I guess tribal warfare, if you will, to me, I wouldn't feel safe. I know that, and I'm sure you wouldn't either if you just went to any country other than maybe Israel and walked down the streets, thinking that you would get to the end of the block without having something happen to you. So I don't view any of these countries as our friend. Some of them may trade with us. Some of them we may have some sort of relationship with, but clearly they're not our friends.
I would suggest that there may be marriages of convenience that have taken place over the years, but whether those conveniences continue to be convenient is the question. And another reason why we ought not be foreclosing the types of energy that we have here at home and increasing our reliance on that part of the world. It's a mess. I wish it were different. I wish there were some secret sauce that you could spread on things and that it would solve all the problems over there. But I don't know about you guys, but it's a damn mess. And it just continues to be, and it continues to cause us problems, and right now it's causing us problems not only in the area, but frankly throughout the world because of our less than well thought out approach.
We have a policy issue, yes.
Yeah. Sorry for searching for my words, but I have to be careful.
No, I understand. Look, I don't even know what our policy is at this point, because it seems like we've played on. If it's possible to be on four sides of a fence, we've done that. But so we've gone to bounds that were never imaginable. But I just want to point this out. John and I had the pleasure to see Waleed Faris last week or the week before, and I mentioned to him that, Waleed, instead of giving weapons to Egypt, if several years ago we just helped them develop economically and made that investment, then more of their people would have been to work instead of to the streets, and things would be entirely differently. We never would have had the overthrow of the government. We would have helped them in a positive way, and simultaneously made ourselves look good for being behind that. And instead, I watched today. We're shipping weapons to one side in Syria. The Russians are doing the other, like I pointed out. It's like fuel to the fire, and I just don't see how any of the types of policies that we have going on are going to fix the problems. Just don't.
Ronald Reagan understood that economic growth and free market economics and capitalism ultimately would lift the greatest number of people in the world and when people are competing economically, they are less likely to get into trouble than when they're all suffering, and that was his general 100,000-foot look at the world and what it meant and why we needed to be strong. And unfortunately, that seems lost on today's generation of leadership.
Yeah, dare I say, do I wish we had Ronald Reagan today? But
yeah, yeah, it would be different. Let's put it that way.
Anyway, folks, I want to thank Dan Kish for joining us today. Such a lengthy conversation, and of course, I'm looking at the instituteforenergyresearch.org. That's so if you go to www.instituteforenergyresearch.org, you can check out all the great reports and information that they have there. You can find stuff that Dan's working on as well. And again, Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, John. Always a pleasure.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye now.